Welcome, everyone. I am Dr. Bharti Kansara, Vice President of American Friends of SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies, London University. And it is my very great pleasure to introduce our distinguished panel, which will discuss the main determinant of the trajectory of our world in the 21st century. Which is the winning model for world superpower? A diverse democracy like the US, or an ethnically more homogeneous and authoritarian state like China? The webinar will be conducted in a conversational style rather than 3 separate presentations, with our moderator, Professor Anthony Saich, Director of the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation at the Harvard Kennedy School, acting as host. He will steer the conversation between all 3 of our expert panelists to a deep exploration of the many complex issues which will determine which political model, that of the US or of China, rises to world leadership. The second panelist in this fascinating debate is Professor Scott Rozelle, who is co-founder and co-director of the new Stanford University Center on China's Economy and Institutions. One of its main foci is the Rural Education Action Project, known as REAP. So we will get a good understanding of rural-urban divides in China and how this will impact central leadership. He has just written a thought-provoking book on this issue called Invisible China: How the Urban-Rural Divide Threatens China's Rise. And our third panelist is our very own Professor Stephen Tsang, Director of the China Institute at SOAS and an Associate Fellow at the Royal Institute of International Affairs at Chatham House. Professor Tsang is an expert on foreign policy, security, and development of the major powers in the region: China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and East Asia generally. His current research project is entitled The Political Thought of Xi Jinping, which is critically important as Xi has recently declared himself political leader of the Communist Party of China for life. We will have ample time for Q&A, so please put any questions that come to mind during the course of the conversation into the chat box, and Professor Saich will select the ones for further discussion. And we will end with a vote of thanks given by Greg Bowie, the wonderful president of American Friends of SOAS. Without further ado, I will hand over to Professor Saich, our excellent moderator.
Thanks very much, Bharti. It's wonderful to be here and also to be with old friends, Scott and Steve, to discuss this simple little question that's posed before us. And I think one of the things that we're looking at as we hope we move beyond a COVID-dominated world, the question really is arising: which nation, if any, will actually assume global leadership and be a key provider of global public goods? And I think the responses of China and the responses of the US to dealing with COVID have obviously provided very different alternatives in terms of approach, but they've also led observers to very different conclusions about this particular question. So some of those who've gone into the Biden administration have concluded that the lack of US leadership in the prior period around COVID, and also with its withdrawal from other areas, really has placed China into a strategic position. Others, by contrast, have argued that weaknesses within China and the lack of its global experience would prevent China from emerging as the global leader. And someone like Ian Bremmer, for example, has said there's no clear leader is going to emerge in this process. So clearly we're seeing a much more complex world emerging. And given that complexity, it seems to me that it's highly unlikely that either model is going to emerge as dominant in terms of global leadership. And we'll drill a little bit deeper on that subsequently. Of course, Presidents Biden and Xi meeting last week revealed clearly that areas of collaboration have to be found and perhaps some form of accommodation, even though both in Beijing and in Washington, people try to pour cold water on that discussion almost as soon as it had been concluded. But as I said in some of the description for this event, there's really, I think, two key reasons for why that kind of collaboration needs to be found rather. And the first is that, China's development is a reality. It's not going to go away anytime soon. And that growth, of course, is attractive to many nations. And the authoritarian structures are appealing to some nations around the world. So the US and other countries are going to have to find a way to coexist with that reality. And we see the divergence of opinions on this and approaches, even within the United States. Business, especially the financial sector, is not going to disengage anytime soon from the lucrative China market, no matter how much pressure government may place upon particular businesses. And secondly, in many ways, I think more importantly, for the US and other countries to meet their own crucial policy objectives, it has to find ways to cooperate with China on resolving them. If we look at decoupling, if we look at some of those issues that have been raised, dual circulation that China's talked about as a form of risk management, mitigation, what it sees as pressures from the West, neither of those objectives can be fulfilled completely from China's side. And as I said, there's a number of issues that really need cooperation if we're to move forward. And I think of that in terms of collaboration around what I think of as new global public goods. And I divide that into three categories. First, those around what one might call the global commons. And clearly, people have already identified climate change as one of those key areas that needs collaboration. John Kerry has clearly been trying to carve out a realm of action in discussion with Chinese partners, which is distinctive from the all-out government approach of confrontation, which is pushed by some within the Biden administration. But there are other issues, fisheries, water shortages, for example. Then there are challenges of global engagement, natural disasters, peacekeeping, and despite the different views about COVID, its origins and what should be done, fighting infectious diseases. And then last but not least, global regulation, how we think about finance, trade regulations, cybersecurity, for example. And on both sides, this is going to require significant changes. It's going to require the United States understanding that it cannot be number one in all areas, but it also will require China to really shift its outdated view of sovereignty and to accept that its actions have a severe impact on the domestic affairs of other countries. Now, achieving those two outcomes may be problematic and may not be that easy to get to. But I think first where we should start is really with Steve, because as was said in the introduction, Steve has been delving deeply into what Xi Jinping has been thinking about. And I suppose for us to kind of set a sight on how we might answer this question, we need to know what is it that Xi Jinping is thinking in terms of global leadership for China. So let's start with you, Steve.
Well, thank you very much, Tony and Otis. Great pleasure to be here this evening. I am only talking about, from my research into Xi Jinping thought, what I believe he is thinking about. Now, when we talk about Xi Jinping thought, we have to bear in mind that it is a work in progress. It's not quite like Mao Zedong thought when it was being proclaimed as a part of Chinese ideology. It was already pretty well clearly developed and formulated. Not quite the case with Xi Jinping. So things can still be changing a bit. And some of what we are reading about Xi Jinping's words and speeches were not in fact his own words. They were written by people led by, in particular, Huang Huning in the Politburo Standing Committee. But everything that had been released in his name had been approved by Xi Jinping. So I think we can take that as representing something that he endorsed. Now, in this view of China's place in the world, I think Xi Jinping is basically saying that the China dream of national rejuvenation is very important. And to quote an recent American leader, that is just to make China great again. Now, what exactly does that greatness entail? Xi Jinping outlined it that by the time of the meeting of the so-called second centenary goal, the centenary year for the founding of the People's Republic of China in 2049, that China will be rich, it will be powerful, it will be strong, it will be vibrant, it will be beautiful. It will be, in effect, second to none. And of course, it will also be united. How can you achieve national rejuvenation if, say, a sacred territory that you claim is not under your jurisdiction? So what we are seeing by 2049, if Xi Jinping can have his way, which is a big if, but if he can have his way, we will see Taiwan being incorporated into China. We will see people in China across the board, whether you're talking about the Han Chinese in China proper, or you're talking about the ethnic minorities in the peripheral areas like Xinjiang, periphery of China, not peripheral areas. They will have to be educated or help to become proper patriotic Chinese. China will expect the rest of the world to pay it due respect. No more capping about what China is doing, no more criticism of whatever China at the time will be doing. The rest of the world will pay it the respect that the Chinese government expects and requires. China will not be a rule taker in the world. China will be the leading rule maker in the world. Xi Jinping never say that he expects China to replace the United States as the only superpower. I can't find him saying something like that at all. But this vision of China's greatness, going back into Chinese history, which is where he found his points of reference, we'll be looking at a China that is second to none. Yeah, and if America will respect China being so, I think that's, they don't have a problem with it. But if America doesn't, well, they need to learn a lesson, wouldn't they?
Thanks, Steve. There's a couple of issues I want to come back to you on in a moment about this question of being a rule maker rather than a rule taker. Because it's always seemed to me that, like most countries, China actually disaggregates the global order. And parts of it, of course, have led to tremendous success for China. Parts it doesn't like human rights regimes and so forth. So we may need to kind of parse out a little bit where it's going to rule make and where it's going to rule take. But I was very struck by another comment you made, and that was by 2049, China being rich, powerful, and being strong. So I want to turn first to you, Scott, because your book on Invisible China was mentioned in the introduction. And if China really is going to be rich and strong, it does need to move beyond its current economic development, to move out of the so-called middle income trap. And I think a lot of Xi Jinping's bravura is based on the idea that China is rising and it's the America and the West that is declining. So do you see constraints domestically within China that might prevent this China dream coming about by 2049?
That indeed is a big question also, Tony. And thank you for your comments, and nice to see Steve and Barty. Thank you for hosting this. Yeah, I mean, I've been working on China for 40 years, right? And I I saw China go through the inflation. I saw China go through Tiananmen, and then the Asia financial crisis, the WTO accession, the world recession of the 2008. And every time the economists of the world said China's going to fail, right? And indeed they drove right on through. And I think that, you know, that's sort of the underlying sort of confidence building platform that China is operating on. And you know, they have come up with, you know, these very I guess successful ways of continuing development in tough times. But I think that development from poor to middle income is a very, very different thing than going from middle income to high income and being a thriving high income economy. And certainly, right, we have lots of examples in the world, like a 70-year experiment in the Soviet Union. The Japan is going to sink, you know, the U.S., and you know, it hasn't grown since the mid 1990s, et cetera, et cetera. And so, and that's because those countries, when they got up towards high income, they couldn't, their economy just couldn't do it, right? And I think that's where China has lots and lots of vulnerabilities, right? I mean, and they have this amazing ability to adapt and go forward. And the vulnerabilities are in, you know, I don't think you cannot plan a high income technology-based economy. You got 192 industries that all have to grow at 2 or 3% a year. You can't plan that, right? It has to be market-driven forces with, you know, with the government trying to bug the holes. And then my book is, if you read my book or you heard other talks, I've given a lot this last year, but the answer is if you look at all middle income countries in the world that are stuck in this middle income trap, the Brazils, the Mexico, South Africas, et cetera, Turkeys. One common characteristic of those countries is they have very poor human capital across their entire labor force. So this is 18 to 65, and of course, why do you need that when you become high income? Because, you know, you're changing jobs, the low income job, the low skill jobs either go away out of the country or they get automated, and you're left with this massive amount of labor, and that's sunk those economies. Okay. And that's what's held those economies back, among other things. Okay. So even whenever I talk to China, inside China about this, I don't care if it's Tsinghua or the American Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai or a philanthropy conference in Shenzhen, when I tell people that, hey guys, do you know that China has the poorest, lowest level of human capital in the entire middle income world? Number one, low. You know, people just, I mean, you hear either a gasp where they, you know, they didn't think they heard me clearly, but that's true. And I think that that's going to be something that holds them back. They have, and you know, Li Keqiang, I'll stop right here, but Li Keqiang already has said this is a problem, right? A year ago, actually 13 months ago, almost to today, he came out and said, hey guys, do you know that we actually have 600 million people that are in the informal economy, the food stall economy, and that they make 1,000 yuan, or, I mean, how do you develop a high income country when you have 600 million people that can't read or write or do math or do computers? They're literate, and just, so I think that that's what's going to be China's, big problem, both trying to plan an economy like this, and then how do you keep it together? So
Yeah,
I'm going to stop right there. We can talk more about that later.
No, I mean, I think this is very important, Scott. And I think for many of us who go to China, we see the kind of gleaming towers of Shanghai, Beijing, and Shenzhen, and we think, how could this be the case? These were fields, and now they're all like downtown Manhattan, as our second.
Better than downtown Manhattan.
Yeah, that's true. That's maybe true. But of course, yeah, I mean, what many of us do not see is that perhaps behind those kind of gleaming false teeth, there's a lot of other challenges and issues going on there. And I want to come back to Steve on a couple of things that, struck me by what you were saying there, Scott. The first is that you talked about the importance of the markets. And in 2013, we were told that, the market was going to be decisive in certain ways. Although I think many people didn't read the rest of those documents that said, no, and the state's going to be pretty important. So Xi Jinping does seem to have dug in with an economic model where he does have a faith in the state sector. So Steve, you've been looking at, his thought. I mean, how is he thinking about this question, of the role of the state in managing this economy? Because that's going to be crucial to get to this proposed nirvana by 2049.
Well, Xi Jinping has said many, many times, he is a Marxist.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't call himself a Marxist-Leninist, which is a bit of an irony because he is one of the ultimate Leninists you have in the Communist Party. I think the other one was Liu Shaoqi.
Yep.
But when Xi Jinping talked about Marxism, he was talking about Marxism-Leninism as he understands it. So the socialist streak is there. But I don't see Xi Jinping trying to attempt a restoration of the Maoist way or the Maoist era. I think I see him as moving forward, modifying his version of socialism by merging in his understanding of the Chinese history and culture and civilization. And the irony is that your orthodox Marxists probably won't recognize Xi Jinping's version of Marxism. Your true scholars of Chinese history will have difficulties with Xi Jinping's version of Chinese history, but that's by the by. He believes it, but he also tries to incorporate this into the 21st century technology, which is the digital world, where you can apply things in a smart way. So his kind of Marxism is a kind of synthesized socialism that is applied in a smart digital way, selectively applied, not completely across the board. He wants to have the cake and eat it.
Mm.
He wants to be socialist and at the same time retain the competitiveness of the strategically important industries of China, for which he is prepared to allow for a bit of more scope for those industries to stay competitive. Whether he can achieve that or not, I think is a really good question. I think the kind of issues that Scott has raised is very serious, because Xi Jinping also says that the middle income trap doesn't apply to China.
Right. Yeah.
He will tell you how many millions of engineers and other advanced degree holders are produced by the Chinese institutions. And this is going to propel China all the way forward and upward and break through all these problems of middle income traps that Greek scholars like Scott talk about so much, which I found totally convincing and persuasive. But
Yeah, I think,
who in the system will dare to tell him that Scott is right? He may need to rethink.
Yeah, I think, it is a warning that, perhaps we should take seriously what Chinese leaders say, because I think we have the tendency to think, well, they can't possibly mean that when they use the socialist or Marxist slogans. And certainly, looking at China's rise vis-a-vis the West's decline, he does use what he calls historical materialism to see that this is now China's age. I was also struck what you said in the high-tech sector, because I think one of the things, I want to come back to Scott on something related to this in a moment, is that, clearly part of getting out of that middle income trap is moving up the production value chain. That also leads into projection of great power, because I think what the leadership in Beijing see is those that set norms and standards in key industries become dominant, not just economic players, but they become dominant political players as well. And that is what Xi is shooting for. Now, Scott, what you seem to be suggesting is without more investment into that educational and nutritional other areas, that's going to be difficult to achieve. But I thought China had invested a lot in the countryside in recent years. But is that not sufficient? Has it started too late? What is actually going on there, Scott?
Well, I mean, there is a lot going on. I often get asked, does China's government know that this is a problem? And I think they do understand that this is, potentially a problem. And, they, to be honest, I don't think that they know the source of the problems but they know that something has to be done. Their response has been this, I've paid a lot of attention to the dual circulation economy issue, because I think that is, basically the direction, especially, you can't figure out how much is COVID and how much is, basically US-China relations and et cetera. But, the idea is, and I like to explain it like this, right? They want to try to create 2,000 fourth and fifth tier cities and urbanize, out in the countryside, and then revitalize the rural economy, right? And those are the two things that they want to do. And I often say, they want 2,000 cities of 200,000 people. So that's 400 million people, right? I mean, it's like 2,000 Cincinnatis. They want to have a growth of 2,000, and you don't want to have 2,000 Cincinnatis in your country, right? And why is it? Well, Terry Sickler, Lee Scher, and her colleagues have just come out with a really nice set of papers on the middle income, the rise of middle income in China. And they go, by 2015, there was 250,000 people in the middle have international levels of middle income, and that by 2020, there was going to be 400 million, and there's 7 million millionaires out there, or say, right? But that still leaves 1.1 billion low income people, 1.4 billion low income. So what we're going to do, and of course, these real true middle income people are in the first tier, second tier cities. So what they want to do is they want to populate all of these fourth and fifth tier cities and with low income people. Okay, these are people with low income, not poor, right? We've solved poverty, right? There's no poor people, but they're low income. What are they going to do? I mean, these cities, you aren't going to be manufacturing. There's going to be some construction, but that's even topped out. Manufacturing jobs in China are falling now. Yeah. Right. And they aren't going to go out to these fifth tier cities. Right. And construction is limited. And so, but of course, what they say is we're going to have this booming service economy. But if you're totally populated by low income people don't consume services. So I have no idea how these local economies are ever going to, I think you're creating 400,000 slums or 2,000 slums with 400 million people in them. And potentially, unless something completely changes. So yeah. I think that's to me, that's how you don't understand, their 2035 goal of, dual, running China's economy by China's demand, and that I just don't get it.
I just had a New Yorker point out to me that downtown Manhattan is still a lot better than Shanghai, contrary to what Scott and I just suggested. So I do want to point that out.
They have better musical halls and
Right.
better Italian restaurants for sure.
Yeah. No, I think this question again, you raised dual circulation and decoupling, which I see as kind of, in many ways, defensive measures or risk management measures that China's introducing. You may have decoupling in certain areas. And I think AI and tech is one which is going to be really significant. but it's almost impossible in other areas. If we think in global financial markets, it's almost a $5 trillion engagement. And, you know, with its budget issues, China needs access to global financial markets. You know, global financial players want to get into mutual funds. They want to get into other areas. And also China can't meet some of its own demands without without being reliant on the global economy. So again, you know, they're nice slogans, but when you really, you know, dig down deep into them, yes, in some areas, but yeah, not necessarily others. But, you know, Steve, and actually I thought it was important, the point you made about manufacturing. Certainly the drop in manufacturing now is much steeper than it is in the US. And what many people don't really remember is that actually manufacturing in the US was at its peak back in 1952. It's been in decline pretty much ever since then. But Steve, I want to come back to this question about where you say being a rule maker, not a rule taker. And where is it that you really think China wants to make the rules? Because if we look at the global order, a lot of it has been really good to China. You know, China's been a major beneficiary since it joined in 2001. So my sense is, you know, it sort of, as other countries do, as the US does, you know, US follows those global norms that it likes and it doesn't follow those ones that it doesn't like. So what is it you think China will really want to zero in on if it wants to be a global leader in certain areas?
Well, I think that you're absolutely right, Tony, that the UN system works very, very well to China's advantage. But then the Chinese government always are able to rewrite history and easily forgets that China not only was present at the creation of the United Nations, albeit the KMT government under Chiang Kai-shek rather than Mao Zedong's communist government, it was actually a lead player in drawing up quite a lot of the UN documentations. But since very few people know about that, they are very able and effective in reminding everybody that the post-war world order was created largely by the Western countries with a huge amount of colonial legacy, with their interests in mind, ignoring the interests of most people in the world. And China is the one that is coming up now to try to seek a bit of redress to that. But China doesn't want to scrap the UN or completely reform the UN. It just wants to make modifications and changes. And it is actually very effective in terms of how it mobilized support from the many countries which are not in the rich, democratic, capitalist Western world, but have the numbers in the UN system to make changes. So you have this wonderful situation that if you go back something like a quarter of a century or even a bit less than that, when the UN still had a Human Rights Commission, China was almost on the agenda every year for discussions. Now, reality is the human rights situation in China today is substantially worse than what it was 25 years ago. I mean, you didn't have the camps in Xinjiang. You didn't have the scale of control over the dissent. 25 years, we're talking about post-Tiananmen. But China doesn't get criticized in the new UN Human Rights Council. They have managed to change it, repackage it, and in effect, stay in the leadership role at the UN Human Rights Council for far longer than any other great power has managed to do, and pack it with friends who would not criticize China. And it is continuing to actually make sure that China's membership in the WTO does not come back in any ways to bite it. And China has set up AIIB, which is now being generally embraced and accepted as a very credible, useful international Development Bank. Up to this point, I think the Chinese government has actually behaved quite well with AIIB. It hasn't really interfered very much. But then there's no reason why the Chinese government would, because the economy is doing so well. And even the Belt and Road projects are doing well. Why is there a problem? I think, I mean, the list goes on. You can talk about how they're managing the BRI and other things. So there are this incremental shift and changes when the norms in China are to be accepted and acknowledged, or at least not subject to criticism. And together with that, other countries which are kind of parallel to the China model or following the China model or being inspired by the China model would also be equally protected. A world that is safe for authoritarianism is a world that is safe for the Communist Party, because no color revolution can reach China in that scenario. That's what they are doing.
Yeah, it's why I like the phrase that Jessica Chunweiss from Cornell has been using of China as a disgruntled stakeholder. And I think that encapsulates a lot of that sort of sphere that, it is a stakeholder, but yes, it's disgruntled in certain other areas. Scott, perhaps, the chat you were just on, that might be worth just repeating for the audience at large, because I think this is a crucial issue about, and it goes back to what we were talking about before, is there a lag in realizing this question of investing in the countryside? It popped up in the chat room.
Actually just responding to him. I wasn't sure if, and so basically what the question was, Scott, I think you got it all wrong. The education problem is a problem of the Cultural Revolution. And he said today in schools, all kids go to 9 years or 12 years of education. And I often say, that there's two problems. The first problem was Deng Xiaoping. Okay, now he was actually responding to the quality of high school, but Deng Xiaoping in 1980 to 85 shut down half of China's high schools. They were Red Guard high schools, right? And he said, all we need is 20% of our kids going to high school, and then half of those can go to college, and half of them go to and that was his policy. And it wasn't until the late 90s that college took off. And then all of a sudden, when they expanded college a lot, they figured, hey, we don't have enough kids to go to high school. And then in 2005, they finally expanded. They went on an effort that they took high school. They added 10 million slots between 2005, 2015. And it's now up to about 85% of kids have a slot in high school. But this is all very, very recent. So if you go to 30-year-olds inside China, less than 40% of them have ever been to a day of high school. So that's one problem, is that, but they see it's a problem now, and they've invested it. So that's good. You're heartened by that. And that's a China response. They figure out there's a problem and they do something very quick. The other problem is I don't think they get is that the quality of education is still very, very low. Mm-hmm. And there's a couple problems there. Okay. And I'm not going to go into it, but to all of them. But the one is they have a school system exactly like the US, which we have 40,000 school districts that are all locally funded. And China has 40,000 school districts, and they're locally funded. Yes, they get transfers from the top. We get transfers from the top, but the programs, the final allocation of funds, the hiring of teachers and the program are all done locally. And why should I send all these rural kids to high quality high school? Do you know that as soon as a kid in a rural county goes to high school, 93% of them leave the county and never come back. Okay, and so they have to. So that's the first thing. The second thing that I'll just mention real quick is we've been working on education for 15 years. We started with college. We then went to high school. We did all this stuff in high school, nothing worked. We did stuff in junior high, nothing worked. We worked on nutrition and health in elementary school, and we had some good results, but there were still big gaps. The biggest problem China faces that no one knows about is their babies. And if China doesn't establish an early childhood education, there's a new systematic review out that shows that 50% of rural babies, and I'm not talking about Xinjiang in Tibet, I'm talking about Henan, Shanxi, Anhui, Hubei babies, 50% of them have an IQ of less than 90. And, you know, they're perfectly good workers, but they aren't high income person. I'll stop there.
When I read your book, that was really staggering. And I know there are groups in China like the China Development Reform Foundation who've been trying to do issues around nutrition and really showing that having decent nutrition in some of these rural schools really does actually bring up the achievements of the kids in those schools. But, you know, it's far from enough to resolve those challenges. And then, as you say, I mean, there's quality, there's reality, and the statistics. I mean, I remember years ago, you know, I was in one particular area of rural China. I was working in a women's health project and an education project. And on one visit, I went down for the women's health project. Everything was wonderful, everything was fine. And I said, do you mind if I just pop in the school, see how things are going while I'm here? Well, I went in the school and there were virtually no kids there. And when I raised that with the village heads, they said, yeah, but you told us you were coming to look at health. If you told us you were coming to look at education, we would have made sure all the kids were here. Anyway, there are a few questions beginning to pop up and keep them coming. And let me start with one which in a way relates a little bit to what you were talking about, Steve, with legacies and colonial legacies of the world order. But this actually goes further to a thing which is much debated, which is this question of, you know, the 100 or 150 years of shame going back to the Opium Wars, the way China was treated. And to what extent do you think that really drives China's thinking about the global environment and politics?
That's a really good question. I will answer it in sort of two parts. One is to say that the century of humiliation that they talk about is really very bad history. I mean, after all, the PRC came into existence in 1949. China became a founding member of the United Nations with a veto at the Security Council in 1945-46 when the UN was founded. So you go, I mean, no country in the world, in the post-war world, enjoy a status greater than that of being a P5. So by any measure, any standard, whatever humiliation you had, that it would have been wiped clean when you achieve that status. So you go back a century, you're going back all the way to the First Anglo-Chinese War, which they call the Opium War. Now, there is a bit of a problem there because the government in control of China, the Tsang government, never saw that there was a problem. They only really seriously saw that China had a problem when China was defeated by Japan in the Sino-Japanese War of 1894-95. For that, you had about 50 years to 1945. So that century of humiliation was just very, very bad history. But does it matter? It matters a hell lot. It's not because of the history, it's because of the recreation of the history, is the party-centric nationalism that the Communist Party is promoting across the board, everywhere in China, through the public media and the education system. which get people to think about the humiliation and about the importance, the centrality of the Communist Party in giving people their country back and dignity back. Without the Communist Party, you live in humiliation. It's with the Communist Party that you enjoy dignity and respect. And it's not actually a very hard sell when you're using that kind of nationalistic language to sell. China is not the only country that does it. I mean, nationalism is always created by the creation of myths. And with the party state having a monopoly of the history and monopoly of the narrative, it gets into the George Orwell observation that he who controls the present controls the past, he who controls the past controls the future. That's what the Communist Party is trying to do. And Xi Jinping is just pushing it to a level that we have not seen before. And you have that extraordinary sense of nationalism in the country at the moment.
I suppose one question related to that is really, is that really a story for all of those that live within the territorial boundaries of what Beijing defines as being China? And that does relate to questions around Hong Kong, around Taiwan, you know, whether they are part of that same narrative that is being weaved. And one of the questions we actually had online is the really difficult question about the Uyghurs and why is China being accused of genocide in that situation? You mentioned the Uyghurs, Steve, earlier in terms of human rights, so I'll give you a chance to reply on that first.
Okay, I think we will have to separate the Chinese government's narrative and what we know on the basis of circumstantial evidence, because a lot of the circumstantial evidence we have, we cannot completely collaborate because we don't have access to Xinjiang. The Chinese government make it very clear that they are not committing genocide in China, and they use genocide not in the definition that is being used by the UN. They use it in the more conventional work-based understanding of genocide, that you're killing off a people, and they say we are not killing off people. So you can't actually say that we are not doing a Holocaust in Xinjiang, and that is true. I mean, they are not putting people in gas chambers or equivalent. But in terms of the UN's definitions, they do meet that definition. But with the Uyghur people, I think the problem Xi Jinping has is that these people are not behaving like patriotic Chinese. If they will behave like patriotic Chinese, China, the Chinese government, Communist Party, might even be able to tolerate their religious practice. Well, not too much of it, because after all, the Communist Party is atheist. And if you have a patriotic mosque, for example, then you can go there. But fundamentally, the problem is that these people have not learned to become proper patriotic Chinese. They have to love Mother China, and loving Mother China means celebrating the party-centric nationalistic narrative of its history, that you have to love the Communist Party and its core leader, Xi Jinping. And that's why they need to be re-educated.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's because the party does have the one dominant narrative. It really finds it very difficult dealing with groups or entities that have an alternative external point of reference. And so, of course, in Xinjiang, Uyghurs have the history going back, which crosses into Central Asian areas, the old idea of a Turkestan empire. Of course, we see the same thing in Tibet, where Buddhism might have external points of reference to the Dalai Lama, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. And so the party, I think, has always had trouble dealing with those sort of alternative points of identity and narrative. And I think what we're seeing under Xi Jinping is a much stronger push to eradicate those alternative narratives and points of reference. And I think it spans across even into religions which are more defined and accepted by the state in China. We've seen more crackdown on Christian worship as well recently in China. So we've got a couple of questions which have popped up. I think we have a couple of minutes here. One of them is about really how does the United States find a role to still be a bastion of democracy with this growing influence of China? And maybe both of you might like to comment on that. How do we find a role?
Let me just say one quick thing on that, because I think it is to engage or not to engage, right? Is a big problem. There's a really good set of papers by my colleagues here at Stanford, Jennifer Pan in communications and Yiqing Xu, who we just stole him from San Diego, and really good political scientist. And they basically, it's how I call the paper. I call the paper, all of China is purple, right? That, we have red states and blue states here, right? And, this, and very defined political, but in China, they went out, this was right before sort of the real deterioration of relations. They did an enormous survey of people's sort of political views, and defined, through a number of questions of were they sort of pro-reform, pro-openness, a little pro-democracy. There wasn't democracy used, but a selection. And then there was sort of more authoritarian, less tolerant, state, state first, party, the need for the party. And what they find is across all of China, they have both those types of people. They're both there, and that that the more tolerant and open one, they've thrived on the openness and the support that they've had from the interaction with the rest of the world. And then they show that when things get shut down, they start to move, people start to move back. They listen to the, to the state propaganda within the state that makes them move over to the less tolerant, less open. And so, this is what I take away from that paper, is that we need to keep engaged, with China, in that otherwise we're going to lose, this, and it's all across China, everywhere. It's west and east and north and south and city and rural. And I think that's why we need to try to figure out how to keep engaged with China. And it's some of the things you said on climate, but I think it's much deeper than that, right? I mean, yeah, it's a hard thing to do. Of course, China has to be fair and open and has to come to the table also. So it's not going to be easy.
Well, we often forget just how pluralistic China is. And if you have a party of 91 million members, and someone has a political agenda, you're bound to join. I mean, I've met, real rabid Marxists. I've met people who are more Maggie Thatcherite than Maggie Thatcher. I've met Stalinists. I've met people who call themselves the Democratic faction in the Chinese Communist Party. I've met others who at heart are just basically anarchists, which I think many people in China are in reality. And so, yeah, I agree. There's, we want to be crowded out, that somehow now there's that one sort of idea. We are getting near the bewitching hour. So Steve, maybe to wrap into some final comments, and something that came up, essentially a couple of people were saying online, what China is really using is its economic clout to get its political way. And I think we are seeing a potential danger in Asia, for example, where you're seeing, as others have pointed out, an economic Asia, which increasingly has China at the core, but a security Asia with the alliances that still has the US at the core, and that bifurcation might be dangerous. So perhaps if you just want to wrap up with a few comments, Steve, because I know we need to leave some time for our hosts to comment.
Tony, just to say that there are many, many people still listening to this webinar, so we can go on another 10 minutes. So please feel free to,
Okay.
you know,
Up to my colleagues, if you want to stay, I'm happy to stay for another 10. I just saw the time is ticking along. But Steve, as a non-wrap-up comment, what would you have to say on this particular issue?
Well, I think this use of economic leverage by the Chinese government for political purposes is to be expected. Great powers all do that. When you can do it, why would you not do that? I don't think China is exceptional in there. But this kind of deals with the whole issue of how we engage with China. We engage with China. I think we should engage with China. We must engage with China. We would like to do it on our terms. So does the Chinese. They want to engage us on their terms. And the reality is that we're probably not going to get very far there because there are some issues beyond just the use of economic pressure, but real pressure points that at some stage is potentially going to blow up if we don't play our cards very, very well. And that is Taiwan. Xi Jinping will take Taiwan when he feels that he can do so. It's a matter of timing. It's not a matter of whether he will or will not do that. I don't think there are very realistic ways that we can deter a determined rising China from trying to do that in military deterrence terms. The only possible deterrence to do that is economic deterrence. If your North American and European democracies combined with Japan and Australasia all say that, look, if this happens, if you try to attack Taiwan, we will have to break off economic relations with you. We know this means we will cancel Christmas. Because if we break off economic relations with you, it is going to have very, very significant negative economic impacts on us. But this is so important because this is potentially going to put the whole world at risk, having two of the world's leading nuclear power engage in a hot confrontation. We just can't have that. That's why we're prepared to do this. So don't do it, because if you do it, we will be very badly hurt. We will pay the price, but you will be economically so devastated that even Xi Jinping will not be able to stay on as leader. That's the only way we can engage to deter. But can we do that? At the moment, we can't. I think the United States need to focus on the democratic allies and persuade them to carry them with the moral authority that the United States used to enjoy in the post-war world. That's the only way that I think we can make sure that we never get to that end.
And that's debatable. I mean, taking it and ruling it are going to be two different issues. And, you know, all of us have spent a lot of time in China. And often when I'm bored, you know, in the countryside or in the cities, I'll ask people, well, Yiding Yao Jiefang Taiwan, do you certainly want to liberate Taiwan? And you'll get an enthusiastic, yes, of course we do. And then when you drill down in the kind of way that Steve was talking about, just think of the consequences of that, trying to rule that place, trying to occupy the place, what possible economic sanctions might be, what that might do for the economy. Then you get a very different response from people. Well, yeah, I want to liberate Taiwan, but I don't want any of that. And so I think you're quite right that, you know, making clear what potential consequences could be is extremely important. And if one looks at, you know, Hong Kong, and there it was relatively easy, I suppose, to bring Hong Kong elites on board, transition them from millionaires into billionaires. But, you know, Taiwan is so considerably more complex that that strategy hasn't worked. It's brought some Taiwanese business people, yes, on board. The KMT and the CCP still talk about the same wars and the same conflicts. But of course, that doesn't incorporate the Democratic Party and Tsai Ing-wen at the present time. So, you know, the sheer idea of trying to manage and rule having taken something by force is just beyond my imagination of what they could or couldn't do. Scott. So.
Tony, let me just add something, and I want to clarify. And this is also the same team. It was a separate paper by Jennifer Pan and Yi-Ching Xu. They went in, and what they were trying to do is to say, let's try to see, is the government clearly says, we're going to take Taiwan and we'll be happy to take by force. They went out to the general population, and it was remarkable, their findings, because the general population in China said, one, do you think South China Sea is China's? And it's like 95% said yes. Is Taiwan China's? Yes, it's part of China. And then they turn around and say, do you think we should use force to take the South China Sea? Do you think we should use force to take Taiwan? And it was like 85% said absolutely not.
Yeah.
and so they just absolute, and they're having tremendous problems recruiting for the military right now, in these rural areas. I mean, we ask these questions, what if you're unemployed, why don't you go to the military? And the answer is, I don't want my kid in a shooting war. Right, exactly. And so I think that there's a very basic difference between the general population and and Xi Jinping, right, who says he wants to take it for his legacy, right? And so
that tallies with my kind of anecdotal stories of just asking people and how people sort of respond to that. One of the points which is raised is which I think is really important. I think it goes back to what Steve was saying about the need for the US to rebuild trust and alliances. And as one person has said, it's very difficult for the US to assert moral authority after the desperate withdrawal from Afghanistan. Personally, this may not be the right thing to say, but I think probably in a year or so's time, Afghanistan might be forgotten and all the shambles of pulling out of there. I think China is probably very nervous about what the situation in Afghanistan will be. But I think what is more serious is whether the US really is committed to long-term alliances, and the potential worry that, okay, Biden is saying, yes, we're back. People aren't convinced. And what are we back to? We're back to a different world where countries are responding differently to China. In the European Union, in the UK, you're willing to criticize human rights issues, but very nervous on questions of trade and investment. And then I think there's the uncertainty. What if President Biden is no longer president in 3 years? Is there President Trump coming back, former President Trump, or is there a similar person that might upset that? So it's very difficult, I think, in the current moment to be able to give countries that surety that America is serious about these kinds of alliances. I don't know, Steve or Scott, if you have any final comments, and then perhaps we'll give it back to our hosts to wrap it up for us. Yes, Steve, go ahead.
I am sort of wanting to come in as a non-American about this reputational damage on the United States. I think it is genuinely very significant. To not acknowledge it, I think, is wrong, misguided. But having said so, I think we should not forget that America has been here before. Vietnam, who thought that America would get back from Vietnam with a high moral authority? And if we, and do forgive me for being not very diplomatic in what I say next. September the 10th, before 9/11, America was the most admired country. To the extent that when September the 11th happened, even the French put it on its headlines, in its major newspapers that we are all Americans.
Right.
I mean, America managed to build back its reputation and credibility. It had done that before. It can do that, but you will have to have Americans not vote for another version of a President Trump. Biden hasn't really quite delivered that yet. I think there was a lot of expectations of America engaging with its European and other allies with respect. Afghanistan was one that was done without respect to allies. I think that was much more devastating than the chaotic scenes in Kabul airport. But it can be done. That's all I want to say.
Certainly opinion polls in parts of Europe and through Southeast Asia, when people are asked for sort of preferences for the US or China, tend to be overwhelmingly in favor of the US rather than China, which must say something. Any final thoughts, Scott?
No, I mean, I this is beyond my pay grade as a development economist, but I agree a lot with what Steve just said. But I thought I think that the more underlying problem is the uncertainty of U.S. politics, and you know, I think that we have to, you know, I think we have to do a lot to because that's the only way we're really going to get an agreement with China. We have to get all the allies, the EU, the UK, Japan, Australia, Canada, all together, Japan, all together. And it's going to be a tough battle, right? We don't all have the same interests. And then we have to make sure everybody enforces it. And then we have to make sure that the offer of the agreement is low enough that China will accept it. And, you know, doing those kind of back and forth, you need a really strong leadership. And if there's doubts about whether, you know, this whole agreement is going to be, you know, turned over on its head again in 2024, I think that therein lies the real challenge. And I think, though, we have to go forward to try to make it work. And it's going to be for everybody's benefit.
Well, I think in terms of the question we were set with this session, we've given a good academic response, which is it depends. But I do want to thank Scott and Steve for a great discussion and very thoughtful comments on the various questions that were asked. And with that, I'd like to turn it back to our hosts.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, I really think we could have gone on another hour or so. It has been so fascinating and such a brilliant discussion, and so many questions still kind of needing sort of greater analysis in the future. But we, you know, really appreciate your expertise and your, you know, wonderful, you know, in-depth knowledge of China and the weaknesses of our democracy here in America also. So thank you so much. And I will now turn over to the President of American Friends of SOAS, Greg Bowie, who will give the vote of thanks. Thank you all. Greg.
Thank you, Bharti. Just a quick note here for everybody, just on behalf of our entire American Friends of SOAS Board of Directors and our entire alumni community here in the US, I just want to extend our sincerest thanks to each of you, our esteemed guests here today, for participating in this virtual event series. So thank you, Professor Saich, Professor Rozelle, and Professor Tsang for your insightful thoughts and this discussion. I also want to thank Dr. Bharti Kansara, my fellow AFSOAS board member, who organized today's event and obviously brought some truly brilliant people on board. We're so appreciative of that. If you enjoyed today's discussion, we appeal to all of you to make a contribution to support SOAS and the exceptional academics on offer there, including at the China Institute, for which Professor Tsang serves as director. I provided a link in the chat box earlier. If you'd like to make a tax-deductible contribution, please do use that link, and you can earmark your gift for any purpose. We, as AFSOAS, every year we provide a one-year top master's scholarship. It comes with housing as well. We've had 7 scholars to date. and they've gone off to do amazing things. And we'd really appreciate your support of that initiative as well. So lastly, I just want to thank all of you for being with us, for making the time to partake in this really important conversation. And yeah, thank you again to all of our panelists. So hope everyone has a great day. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Great to see you both. Bye-bye.
Good to see you,
Thanks,
Tony
Tony.
and Steve. Nice to meet you. Bahar.
Yep, thanks, Marty. Thanks, Greg.
You're very welcome. It's been terrific.
Great event. Thank you all.